All right, welcome to Alabama Gristmill. I am Mike Causey with my co-host, Donna Causey. How you doing?
I'm doing fine. How are you doing today?
Doing fine. It's good to be back doing this story here today in this podcast, and especially in these dreary days of winter that we're in right now. We're dealing with a bunch of clouds and rain here in the not much snow, but clouds and rain.
Well, it's not that way everywhere. I got sun today, so
that's good.
It's nice. But it is miserable sometimes when it's just nothing but clouds and rain to look out at and cold.
I don't know about miserable, but I think it's uncomfortable. Miserable is kind of what people faced when they moved and settled to early Alabama. Those were the miserable days, and it was challenging.
Can you imagine without heat to keep them warm? Except maybe a fireplace, and they didn't even have houses at first. They had to camp outside. That's what we're going to get into today. We're leading into that one, aren't we?
Making a nice little segue into it. It's a story we've got today is about the early days and the pioneer days of moving into, and what it took, I guess, to move into the state of Alabama, and why the help they received from the Native Americans and Cherokees in this case.
Yeah.
And it just gives a colorful look of the challenges people would face at the time, and the perspective, I guess, that they had about, their move, and it's through their words, which is where I really like about it.
Yeah, it's kind of typical of most people who came into Alabama in the early days, too. That gives us kind of a perspective of what our ancestors faced and what their life was like. So this is kind of a colorful story that gets a little bit more interesting than some. So
it's taken from the writings of Reverend Anthony. He was a circuit preacher that moved into Alabama. So, and he just also describes about, them being his dad, I believe, was a doctor, brought him in and all that kind of stuff to very good detail. So it kind of gives a really neat little perspective.
I think people will enjoy it because they can kind of picture their own ancestors, through the eyes of what this man had written. He wrote it in the Gadsden Times about his family when they moved into it. Back in, way back, I'm not sure of the date he wrote it on the Gadsden Times, but it's transcribed from the Alabama Historical Quarterly in 1946.
Oh, yeah. And this is when he moved in, moved to the state of Alabama was around the early 1800s, around 1835, 1840s.
Right.
So it is definitely the early pioneer days in Alabama.
It's the name of our podcast anyway.
Is that why? Well, the podcast is called Gristmill.
Oh, that's right. The Alabama Pioneers, I was thinking.
Pioneers is the website.
Well.
Well, you got it.
I got it. I think Alabama Pioneers on everything, I guess.
Yep. Well, before we get into it, I'd like to do the usual business of just mentioning what we do to help support what we got going on here and keep this thing going and bringing the history to life. Is the patronage program that we have set up through the Patron website. And you can join that. It's a monthly subscription to the site. And for as little as $2 a month, you can help support what we got going on here. And then, of course, you can donate whatever you like to. We appreciate that. But that $2 a month gets you early access to different articles and on the website, as well as the podcast and things like that. So, and there's various awards that you can see on the site. When
we have a monthly drawing for a free autograph book, too. So that's another little thing that you get. Only the Patreon members get to participate in that too. So your odds of getting a book are very high.
Yeah, and we always appreciate what the patrons we currently have, because y'all keep this going. So thank you very much. And we're actually coming up on 100 podcasts here on the next one. This is number 99, so we've got 100 podcasts under our belt. So, and we'll be constantly working to improve those because they seem to be going over real well. Got a lot of listeners out there and things like that. So share with your friends and family if they like hear a little bit of history of Alabama. But with that, I'll let you go ahead and take us into the story of Reverend Anthony and the early days, pioneer days of Alabama.
Today's story is from an excerpt published in the Gadsden Times and transcribed from the Alabama Historical Quarterly, Volume 8, Number 3, the fall issue of 1946. It's a very interesting story written by someone that was here in the early days of Alabama, Reverend J.D. Anthony. He was born in 1825 in South Carolina. His father was one half English and the other half Dutch, and his mother was one half Irish and the other half Dutch. It kind of symbolizes a lot of the ancestry of many people in the early days of Alabama. People that were just looking for a greener pasture, which was the case in this situation. I'm going to quote from what Reverend Anthony said about his father. In the autumn of 1835, my father, Reverend Whitfield Anthony, determined to leave the old red hills and sandy bottoms of South Carolina and go to a land that flowed with milk and honey. And Anthony goes on to describe their travels to Alabama. First, his father traveled extensively over Georgia and Alabama, seeking out their new home, and he settled on the north and west of the Coosa River, on the south by Terrapin and Frog Creeks, and on the east by the Georgia line. Then, as most men, he returned back home to get his family and talk about the land that he had found. He gave the description, Reverend Anthony said, as a glowing description of the modern Eden that he had found. And that's what they thought about Alabama, many of the settlers who came here in the early days. Because of all the bountiful farmland, they saw good potential, the trees, the fowl in the air, and because of all the good things they found in Alabama. The time arrived for the move, and farewells were uttered, tears shed, and the whip cracked as the wheels rolled on their party of 40 immigrants who set out on a journey for over 2 weeks. They crossed the western Georgia line about the middle of November 1835 and were informed that they were in the Alabama portion of the Cherokee Nation. They immediately met with many in the Cherokee Nation. He said they rode on till a late hour in the evening, staying on the old Georgia and Alabama road. Finally, they arrived at what was called Spring Creek, which was later called South Spring Creek, to distinguish it from one of the same name in the northern portion of the county, and camped there for a few days to replenish their empty larder and to allow the men to look around and see if they could find a suitable place for locating their future home. While the older men were out home hunting, the young men were detailed to take the dogs and bring in something to eat. But they kept looking around and trying different things, but never could acquire any food until late in the evening. And they did succeed in catching 2 hares, but that's little food for 40 people. So thanks to the older men who arrived shortly after carrying a deer, the party had food. The men said they brought the deer from a friendly Indian. Reverend Anthony said his father bought a homestead from a man named Martin. The house was a cabin 16 feet by 18 feet, covered with 4 feet boards, secured by logs on top which were called weight posts, and floored with split logs. They had a spacious kitchen, which was 12 by 14, with a dirt floor. The house was later built on the first elevation of uplands adjoining the rich river lowlands. Martin had halfway cultivated about 5 acres of land and had deadened, as they called it, about as much more, and around which he had made a rough fence enclosed by a structure of rails and posts 6 feet high. He said why he was selling was because he wanted to leave the country because it was becoming too thickly settled. They later learned true facts about Martin's departure, which may have been a little different. He had evidently left his wife in Tennessee and somehow found himself in possession of another man's wife, as Reverend Anthony said. Perhaps the consciousness of those facts had something to do in forming the views that the population was getting too much large. Maybe somebody was going to track him down. But anyway, Martin left for parts unknown, and no one ever heard from him again, according to Reverend Anthony. Anthony described the location as 1 mile south of Coosa in what was then called the Lay McKay Bend, 3 miles west of the mouth of Mud Creek, 2 miles from Cotham's Ferry, 4 miles from the site of Cedar Bluff, and about 1.5 miles from what was known as Howell's Crossroads. Some of their nearby neighbors were Ambrose Vanderver, who was the nearest neighbor. He had a large family, and there were a lot of mostly females. And he got into trouble somehow and was charged with an attempt to violate a poor girl. Anyway, he wound up having lost all his worldly goods, only escaped with his life, and left town. And they don't know. He went west, escaped the justice system. Anyway, John Lay was another one who lived with his aged father, according to Anthony. And he was the father of Captain C.M. Lay of Gadsden. They lived about 1 1/4 miles from Reverend Anthony on the bank of the Coosa, along with his mother-in-law, Mrs. McCoy, with her 2 sons, William and John, and her daughter Nancy. Below the McCoys, Mr. Absalom Reagan lived, who may have been the son-in-law of Mrs. McCoy. 2.5 miles northwest of Reverend Anthony's family lived old John Cothran and Major Sam Martin. Major Martin died 3 or 4 years later after their arrival, so that makes it somewhere around 1838 or 1839. And a lot of members of the family died also. His son, Charles Bingley, though, became a Baptist preacher. Anthony says that on his arrival in the area, though, there were no churches for divine worship. The Sabbath was not observed. They just went hunting on that day and took the day off. And they were always seen, instead of worshiping in churches, they were out with guns on their shoulders, ready to hunt. But with his father's insistence and the help of cooperative neighbors, they finally built a church building 18 feet square. It was built of split chestnut logs. The pulpit was constructed of split timbers, and they didn't have a floor for a long time, but finally put in a split log floor. So it was a very rough church. This meeting house was located about 1 mile from Cothran's Ferry, near the spot where John Spann Esquire later settled. His father preached monthly in the new meeting house, and 2 Baptist preachers from Terrapin Valley named Casey and Minton preached there frequently, and occasionally Reverend William Taylor and James Wilson of the same denomination preached there. So it was a sharing, because his father was a Methodist minister. It was a sharing situation for the ministers in that meeting house. Reverend John Faust had been sent by the Alabama Conference of the Methodist Church as a missionary to the Cherokee country. He had heard that all the people had built a house of worship, and he wanted to see it. So he went looking for it. Reverend Anthony tells of the day of his arrival. He was out one evening, and he saw a heavily built, square-shouldered man approaching, riding an iron gray horse with saddlebags under him. He presented to my eye the appearance of a Methodist immediately, and a tenement Methodist preacher. So strongly was I impressed with the striking resemblance that he bore to the men of that class in my native land, that I ran and told my mother a circuit preacher was coming. He said his mother ran to the door and looked out and said, "Oh, I warrant he's the missionary from the other side of the river." And the traveler said, "Madam, I'm a Methodist missionary, but out hunting the lost sheep of the house of Israel." And she was very happy to welcome him in. Mr. Faust was a laborious, faithful man of God, according to Anthony, and he was a man of strong faith in God's promises. He believed that by prayer and faith and God's promises, he could cure many of the diseases that people would get. So he was a healer as well. Reverend Faust and Reverend Anthony's father and Reverend Newton Randall organized churches at different parts in the Cherokee Nation. They constituted one on South Spring Creek, one on Mud Creek, and one near Galesville. And during the first year of the stay in the nation, there was a campground established near Galesville, which was called Sulphur Springs. Judge Birdwell, who was the first probate judge of Cherokee County, built a tent there. Also, Elijah Fatty and his son John Honorable George Clinton, who afterwards represented the county several times in the state legislature, also were in the area. Reverend Anthony continued. He said there was a preacher by the name of Booker, of whom a pious old lady once remarked God bless that dear good man. He's the first man I ever heard preach standing on his knees. But she was mistaken. He was just a short man. And he was standing flat-footed and reached up as far as he could above the pulpit. Robert Ware, the father of Mrs. Dr. Edwards of Atala, built a tent on that ground and attended at the second camp meeting. And Reverend Anthony stated that the Cherokee Indians attended the meetings in large numbers. Many of them had been converted into the preaching of the missionaries. They were devoutly pious, and a large number were converted at each meeting. He said he noticed that most of them, on professing conversion, shouted aloud and gave expression to their feelings as the whites did. What surprised him the most was those among them who didn't speak a word of English, once they were converted, would always start shouting, "Glory, glory." And that's how they knew they were converted. The Methodist Church was mainly represented in the north of Coosa by Reverend Newton Randall and old Father Booker, and on the south side by Reverend Anthony's father. His father, he described, was labored during the week and preached every Sunday, and he also attended meetings in parts of the Cherokee Nation, so he was a very active man. Reverend Anthony said, "My father had some knowledge of science and of medicine as well, and he bought a good stock of medicines with him from Carolina for family use." So between the services as a physician and preaching and laboring on the farm, he didn't have much time for anything else. But he never charged anything for his services and furnished the medicines without money or price. So he was well thought of in the community. In the course of 3 or 4 years, Anthony says that Methodism was firmly planted among the Cherokees due to their efforts. Some other Methodist ministers mentioned by Reverend Anthony were John Patty, William Fleming, Jared Jack, Haman Bailey, John Kuykendall, Joel Wims, and Mr. Reeves, Mr. Mountain, and Tolliver Spann. It was said that Kuykendall later had some mental problems and he was sent to the hospital for the insane at Tuscaloosa. And Wims, at last count, was in the southern part of the Cherokee County in the neighborhood of where he first located in the early settling of the county. Fleming used to preach with his eyes either closed or raised at an angle of 45 degrees above his congregation, which kind of distinguished him. Anthony said that he always regarded him as an earnest man, but he happened to mention an anecdote that Fleming would always quite often tell, and it was about George Washington and Putnam of Revolutionary War fame. It was kind of interesting because we do know that Washington fell in love with a young lady before he married. Anyway, the story goes, both men fell in love with the same lady, George Washington and Putnam, and that the lady decided to leave her choice between the two on a feat of agility. So one day, they set out and decided that they would try to show that one was more agile than the other. And Putnam leaped 21 feet on the first bound, and Washington beat him by 6 inches and got the young and beautiful widow. Well, that's kind of an amazing story. I guess it's kind of like chopping down the peach tree and everything else. An Indian preacher by the name of Thomas J. Meigs was a full-blooded Cherokee, and he often spent days at his father's house. And he was a member and a minister in the Methodist Church and appeared to be devoutly pious, according to Anthony. He spoke English quite fluently for an Indian, but he would not preach, praise, sing, or even ask a blessing in English. And his father inquired of him why he did not, when praying among and for the whites, use their language. And his reply was, "The Apostle Paul say, no preach, no pray in unknown languages. That's why I do not do it." Anthony's father often spoke of Meigs and once asked him about the mounds in the land. And Meigs stated that the Cherokee did not make them. They were there when the Cherokees first arrived in the land. Meigs was a boy back then, he said, and other Indians who were blacker and bigger than the Cherokees were there on the land. He said that they didn't get along and that the Cherokees and black Indians fought continuously. While they were gone, the black Indians killed off squaws and children left back at home, and Meigs lost his arm during that time when he was shot. The Cherokees continually fought, and finally the Cherokees killed off the Black Indians, warriors, squaws, and the children. Then they burned the town and took the country from them. He said it was probably the Black Indians who built the mounds because they were there before they came. Anthony later states that Reverend Martin Sims, who was a missionary in 1822 through 23 to the Choctaw Indians, told him that he often heard the older warriors among the Choctaws talk of a war against the big Black Indians, in which the Choctaws and the Cherokees united and were literally fought the Black Indians together, and they exterminated the Black Indians. He said that also that the Choctaws located the scene of the final battle at a town on the banks of the Big Warrior near the present site of Tuscaloosa, which is an interesting story and one that's not probably shared a lot. There's an oral history from that time.
Well, that was pretty crazy. I guess crazy, but it's pretty interesting.
I don't think it sounded crazy.
No, it wasn't crazy. It was just interesting in the sense that, gosh, they had a lot of things going on, a lot of challenges in the time, but it seems like the communities came together and they pulled their resources and got the helps from the Cherokee Indians at the time, you know.
I liked how he described what they were like when they preached and things like that. Little anecdotes about how they looked when they preached. You know, that was interesting that Reverend Anthony added in this. So,
and I like the Thomas Begg, the Indian preacher that was the full-blooded Cherokee guy.
Oh, I liked
and that story about, you know, possibly not, you know, the mounds were there before they got there. You know, that was interesting. So
that was a real interesting part, I thought.
It's always good to hear just different aspects of the of history of Alabama. I always enjoy that. So, well, with that, we'll go ahead and wrap this episode up of the Alabama Gristmill. And glad you joined us. And please subscribe, share, like, review, all that good stuff on your podcast players that you got out there. And with that, we'll see you later, and let Red Foley play us out with a little Alabama Jubilee.
Goodbye. We'll talk to you later.
Dancing round on his toes, throws away his crutch and hollers, hey, let her go, oh honey, hey.